So we are now live, or as I say with every webinar, I certainly hope we are, or this will be embarrassing. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Ben, I'm representing the Pinsker Centre this evening. The Pinsker Centre is a think tank. We host open debate, we defend free speech at universities across the United Kingdom and do have international partners every now and then, as we do this evening. Please make sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn to find out more events that we host. We have only just today posted our next event, so please look out for that. It's with H.R. McMaster, the retired US Lieutenant General and former National Security Advisor to President Trump, so keep watching this space. Our question today is, will the Biden presidency be better for the Middle East? We brought to you our expert academic support to argue the case. Arguing that the Biden presidency will be better, we have Professor JOHN STRAWSON, who is an author, law professor at the University of East London, where he teaches international law and Middle East studies, specialising in the areas of law and postcolonialism, with particular reference to the Middle East, Islam and international law. Professor STRAWSON is the director of the Centre of Human Rights in Conflict and was previously a visiting academic at Birzeit University. Thank you very much for joining us again. Professor STRAWSON is a favourite of ours. Arguing that a Biden presidency will not be better for the region is MATHEW RJ BRODSKY, who is a Middle East expert, geopolitical analyst, and a senior fellow at both the Gold Institute for International Strategy and Security Studies Group. Mr. Brodsky has been an advisor to the Trump administration's Middle East peace team. He's also policy and political director for Dalia Al-Akidi, a Republican candidate running against Ilhan Omar in Minnesota's 5th Congressional District. Please note that Michael Doran, who was originally scheduled to speak, is no longer able to make it due to conflicting arrangements. We look forward to hosting Mr. Doran on another date in the near future. Moderating our debate this evening is Joseph Kosk, a dear friend of the Pinsker Centre, who is a tutor in PPE at St. Peter's College at the University of Oxford. We would like to thank our partners for tonight's event, which is the RRIS IDC Debate Society, UCL's International Relations Society, Manchester Young Conservatives, and the Israel Associations at Birmingham and Warwick University, and to both our speakers and our moderator for accepting our invitation. Before I hand off, I just want to remind the audience, please post questions in the Q&A section or in the comment section on Facebook. Our team will pick them up and send them over to Joseph. So make sure to do that. And if you are a student, please, the format is first write your university and then your question. I will now bow out and hand you over to the capable hands of Joseph. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Should be a fascinating debate. Thank you very much, Professor Strawson and Mr. Brodsky. We're going to start this debate with about 5 minutes of an introduction, an opening speech from Professor Strawson on why Joe Biden would be better in terms of foreign policy for the Middle East, in general. And then afterwards, we'll hear an opening speech from Mr. Brodsky, likewise 5 minutes before hearing rebuttals and opening it up to the floor. So without further ado, we'll open up the floor to Professor Strawson.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, especially on this important day when the elections are actually taking place. I think that the big issue for the Middle East and for America is actually to have a policy on the Middle East, a comprehensive policy on the Middle East. The Trump administration essentially has not had a policy. It has had political instincts, which have sometimes been very random. And if you actually think about it, what has this Trump administration done for the Middle East? It has done the following. It has made the Iranian nuclear threat to the world greater. It left the joint comprehensive plan for action in the 2015 agreement, which was to provide some limitation on the pace of Iranian nuclear weapons, the nuclear program. And in fact, having left it and merely imposed some sanctions essentially on the banking industry, and one or two other economic sanctions, has no other policy of how to prevent Iran developing a nuclear weapon. So we are, as a consequence of the Trump administration, we are nearer to an Iranian nuclear weapon than we were in 2016. Secondly, It is, of course, quite true that the Trump administration has been able and has facilitated the normalization of relationships between three Arab states and Israel. This is extremely welcome. However, I would point out something, that the UAE development was something that hard work was actually done by British Prime Minister Tony Blair, or former Prime Minister Tony Blair, when he was the envoy to the Quartet in the Middle East. And therefore, this is not exactly a surprise, and we know exactly why this has been opened at this precise time. It is largely to do with the facilitation of arms sales from the United States to the UAE. So it's a kind of peace agreement through arms sales. The pressurizing of Sudan has not been necessarily, may not turn out to be productive, because the Sudanese have got a temporary government, interim government, and when the elections take place, this could very much well be, the question of Israel could very much be an electoral question. On the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, what we've actually seen is gratuitous action by the Trump administration to against the Palestinians, the moving of the embassy, which was no particular reason to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. In fact, as I said before, they've only merely moved the sign of the embassy, as a matter of fact. The cutting off of direct American diplomatic relations with the Palestinians through the consulate in Jerusalem with the Palestinians has been very unwise. The cutting off of a huge amount of annual aid to both the Palestinian authorities and to Palestinian refugees has merely intensified the conflict, not in fact resolved it at all. And unfortunately, what the Trump administration has done in the Middle East is what it's done in the United States domestically. Its main policy is to divide. Its main policy is to create divisions and not to bring people together. The United States itself is extremely divided, and essentially the actions which the United States have done in this administration has been to further divide and make a more difficult situation even more difficult in terms of a Palestinian-Israeli agreement. We know full well that the Trump plan, the plan of the century, which, as one of my Israeli friends says, the question is which century is it for, is essentially something which the Palestinians could not possibly accept. I suspect that's why it was put forward. It is a completely unacceptable plan for the Palestinians. It's one which is far worse than was offered and discussed at Camp David in 2000 and then in 2001. It's worse than what Prime Minister Olmert was discussing. And in fact, it doesn't offer a genuine two-state solution. Joe Biden is offering the following. He is offering a recommitment to the two-state solution. He is opposing annexation, any Israeli unilateral annexation of occupied territories. He is against settlement expansion. He is in favor of restoring the financial cuts to humanitarian aid, which the United States has conducted against the Palestinians. He wants to reopen the consulate to deal with the Palestinians in Jerusalem, and he wants to re-enter the Iran nuclear deal. And it seems to me that these are highly constructive policies, and they go alongside a commitment to the United States taking a better position on the question of human rights in the Middle East, in particular in relationship to Saudi Arabia and also in Egypt. It seems to me that these package of policies provide some hope for the Middle East, because it's all very well saying that President Trump has had a great breakthrough with the normalizations with Israel. The key security for Israel in the long term is an agreement with the Palestinians. And therefore, to provide and to provoke the Palestinians into and Palestinian leadership into a position where they cannot really begin to accept any of the stuff on the table of the Trump plan, puts that back, and that endangers the security of Israel, as indeed does the renewed nuclear program which Iran has undertaken. And of course, it was very happy that the United States walked away in one sense, particularly for the hardliners, walked away from that agreement. It allowed them to go back to it. And basically what Donald Trump has done is handed the real hardliners in Tehran a very, very good present for the next Iranian elections. So my argument is we want a Biden administration to end division. We don't want to intensify division. We want to bring people together. And that is what I think the package of policies which Joe Biden has the prospect of doing. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Professor Strawson. And now we will hear the opening remarks from Mr. Matthew Brodsky.
Thank you. And thank you very much for hosting this fascinating debate. I would say that obviously I have a different viewpoint than the professor, but there is one major point where I think we would agree, and that's that the Trump administration wouldn't be where it is in the Middle East without being able to thank the Obama administration, and of course Biden was a part of that, for everything that they did. Now, of course, it happens to be the direct result that the Obama administration was not anticipating. For instance, the nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, is an agreement that does not work, wouldn't have worked. In fact, just in October 18th was when the conventional arms embargo went off. So we enriched the Iranian regime and we're going to leave them after some period of years, just a screw's turn away from being able to have nuclear weapons. The deal was something that the Obama administration lied to the American people about what would be in the agreement and what they would accept, and then lied about what was actually in what they agreed to. And to this very day, their people, Ben Rhodes, John Kerry, all the same cast of characters with whom Biden surrounds himself, continue to lie about what the deal was. The agreement was horrible. President Trump was quite right to pull the United States out of it, and that's what he did. My only argument is that he should have done so earlier. Now, as far as a comprehensive type of foreign policy, at least in the region that the Trump administration has, it was to undo what the Obama policy was, which the Iran deal itself was designed to lock in the United States' strategic realignment toward Iran. What we were doing by having that deal, which restricted us in so many ways throughout the region, was to try to realign and hope that a moderate form of leadership would come to the fore in Iran. That is fantasy. So what the Trump administration did was, on one hand, focus on states, kingdoms, sovereign nations who have common interests with the United States. And these are many of the countries and states that we've always had as allies, and to focus on working with them. The idea when it came to the peace process with Israelis and Palestinians was there needed to be a breakup of the mythology, because doing the same thing that has been tried and failed for decades and expecting a different result would be foolhardy. So they sent about having a peace process that would work between Palestinians and Israelis. The Palestinians didn't show up. Incidentally, when the Obama administration decided in the very early days there had to be a complete settlement freeze, and Hillary Clinton said that means no natural growth or anything, the Palestinians still never came to the table to show up. They have no intention of coming to the table, and the demands that they currently have are frankly not something Israel is ever going to give them. There's a roadmap that was put down by the United States, and the fact is, after that, the Trump administration wanted to see where there were common deals that could be made in the region. And if it weren't for the fact that everyone in the region was nervous by the Obama administration abandoning not only our traditional Arab allies, but essentially throwing Israel under the bus, you probably would not have had this type of normalization agreements that they had. Now, incidentally, to show an example of how the Trump administration's overall comprehensive policy, we should look at Sudan. It's a great case where the president is able to say, in the war on terrorism, there was a state that hosted bin Laden, hosted al-Qaeda, and then after that, after 9/11, started hosting Hezbollah and was the major transit point for weapons going into Hamas and Gaza. Without the US firing a weapon, we provided financial inducements, are going to help provide for them a much better future, and it's going to work for the people there a whole lot better. So this is a much better way of conducting the, quote, war on terrorism. Now, luckily for the main overall question of this debate, will a Biden foreign policy in the Middle East be better? Look, you just need to look at what the Obama policy is, because that is, in the best case scenario, what it will be, because it's those same people. The other side that you could look at, which many Americans fear, is it would be the more progressive wing of the Democrat Party, the Ilhan Omar, AOC people who don't think Israel should exist at all, and who frankly would throw any of our allies under the bus. They blame America first. You see that in American culture, on the streets, throughout the summer, and that's the kind of thing you've seen translated into our foreign policy abroad. I'll leave it there for you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Mr. Brodsky. And before we open up the floor to questions, we're going to open up the floor once again to Professor Strawson for a rebuttal against Mr. Brodsky's remarks. The floor is yours.
Well, it's very interesting that Matthew ended on the question of the war against terrorism. And I was fascinated to read today in the New York Times that the Taliban, who are involved in the negotiations, very unwise negotiations in my view, about ending the conflict in Afghanistan, which would be basically ending it in the favor of the Taliban, are backing the Trump to win the presidency. So I think it's quite ironic who the friends of Donald Trump turn out to be, actually. Let's be very clear. What I said about the agreement with Iran was that having walked away from it, the United States had no alternative to it. That's the truth. You say people lied about it. People didn't lie about it. It was highly debated. It was debated in the United States Congress. It was particularly debated because Prime Minister Netanyahu wanted it debated and actually went and appealed to the United States politicians to reject it, which they didn't do. So it was very open and openly discussed, but it was the only thing. It was the only instrument to delay the development of Iranian nuclear weapons. And the truth of the matter is, we are now nearer Iranian nuclear weapons than we would have been had the Trump administration not left. The second thing I'd like to say about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Look, we are told that Donald Trump is a great deal maker. Of course, we now know from some financial documents which have been recently released, particularly by the New York Times, that he's perhaps not so clever at that, as a matter of fact. But surely anyone who makes a deal knows you have to make a deal with two sides. And if the Palestinians are one of the sides, then you have to deal with the Palestinians and the Israelis together. And the great genius of the Oslo process and during the Clinton administration was the drawing together of the Palestinian and the Israeli leadership, and of the relationship which was created between Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin. And that is completely missing in the way in which Trump approaches the question. What he's done is try to humiliate the Palestinians, in other words, to make the Palestinians less able to actually negotiate. People only negotiate if they feel, first of all, that they have a strength in the negotiations, not a weakness. What he's asking the Palestinians to do is to accept complete defeat and to accept a statelet entirely on the terms of the United States. And you know full well, and Matthew knows this, no side in negotiation could possibly begin to accept that. And so what you have essentially is an intensification of the conflict, putting off the day, which will come, and it will inevitably come, when the only way in which Israel's security in the Middle East is going to be enhanced is when there is a Palestinian state living alongside, in peace, living alongside the state of Israel. And that is the great goal. And if you don't have that goal, which I don't think Trump has, you can't achieve it. The great thing about the Biden administration a Biden administration, which I hope we will see in the next day or so, that, of course, not until January, but I hope the election results will go in that way, and I think they probably will. We will begin to see a return to the United States, not only prioritizing the question of negotiations and bringing people together, but also restoring confidence in the international institutions, which are so important to surround the way in which the Middle East operates, and that which the Trump administration has done so much to undermine, whether it's the United Nations or whether it's financial institutions or whether it's on climate change and so on and so forth. This wrecking of trying to wreck the international agreements has had a very bad effect. And I'll tell you one other thing. The effect of that of trying to undermine the international order is it has encouraged those people in Israel, like Prime Minister Netanyahu, to think that they also can break the rules and that there are no consequences of breaking international rules. And I think that is a really bad result of this administration. And by the way, one last thing, it would be very good, I think, for the United States to actually appoint someone who would be an actual ambassador from the United States to Israel, rather than to have someone who is the ambassador in name, who essentially is active within Israeli politics. So I think it would be very good for Americans to have a genuine ambassador in Israel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Strawson. And if we could hear from Mr. Brodsky a rebuttal to that.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, I'm sure that Ambassador Friedman would appreciate the dig at the fact that he's essentially Jewish and loves Israel and also loves the United States. That's really not a problem. I think President Trump is quite fine with who he picked for an ambassador. Look, on the part that we're talking about the Iran deal, once the deal was made in 2015, people who were against the deal, even like me, who are on the other political side of the aisle, but also even Democrats at think tanks here, were saying that the United States needed to take the time to work with Europe before implementation day in 2016 to come up with a system of penalties that could be put against Iran if they cheat. Now, what happened instead? John Kerry went out and drummed up business. Okay, he was acting like an economic center for Iran to get investment into Iran. He did that instead. The Trump administration had a good debate when it came into office, which was between those who wanted to fix the deal on one hand and those who wanted to nix the deal on the other. And in the beginning, those who wanted to fix it won out. So the United States first had to deal with Europe and had a lot of discussions with Europe over how to make the deal stronger, how to come up with ways that you could actually punish Iran, because in the deal, there's only one recourse if Iran is cheating, and that's to tear up the deal. That's it. There were no penalties agreed to. That's how stupid the deal was. In fact, the deal was so bad, this that they sell and try not to lie about, they even delisted Qasem Soleimani, the head arch terrorist who the Trump administration killed, who was freely roaming the Middle East, who was responsible for the maiming of well over 1,000 US troops and killing of some 600 or so, just when US was involved in Iraq. Those were IRGC-made IEDs. So Europe, I'm sorry, and I know that this is coming to you from London, but Europe failed the United States. This is how the Trump administration, frankly, has viewed the whole internationalism aspect, that we should strengthen international institutions. If you can tell me today that you think the world is better off because now freely Iran can purchase whatever conventional weapons it wants, yeah, that's fine. And that it can work on its missiles, that's fine, because again, the UN language that was passed didn't even say you can't. It just spoke of like you shouldn't. It's not even legally something that can be enforced. This is something that the United States worked with Europe to try to come to an agreement, to at least push off the conventional weapons ban, which is one of the several sunset provisions that was contained in this horrible agreement. And even then, Europe wouldn't work with us, not even the UK. So this is another reason why the Trump administration is going to look after America's interests. He expects other states are going to look after their interests. Now, as far as everything the professor said on the peace process, look, at some point you have to get tired of repeating the same mistakes and using the same slogans. And that's all that they are. The idea that you're going to have statehood for Palestinians on all of Jerusalem, on the 1967 lines completely unadulterated, and that you're going to have the return of the refugees, which are their key demands and have been so since the early 90s. And if you think that that's something that any Israeli leadership, left to right, is ever going to accept, you're just living in a fantasy, because that's not reality. The Trump administration wanted to have a process based on reality, and foremost amongst that is dealing with the mythology that is developed where Palestinians don't feel like the leadership is actually looking out for them, and the leadership doesn't actually think that it's incumbent on them to make any compromises or to deal with their own mythology. Instead, what they've done is what the professor suggests: rely on international institutions. They'll go to the ICC, they go to the UN, they internationalize the conflict. They have a Palestine 194 plan, which was something from years ago that they have developed, which is to use the international community, and that will bestow upon them all the trappings of statehood, except they won't have a state. No, sorry. The Palestinian leadership needs to grow up and deal with reality and deal then with Israel directly in negotiations. That's how they can find peace. And if everyone's going to explain from the outside somehow that it's in America's interest to immediately create a failed Palestinian state right next to Israel just because it makes Western liberals feel good about themselves, is a bit ridiculous. If there's going to be a Palestinian statehood, it needs to actually be able to function, it needs to be responsible to its people, and it needs to be based on reality, not based on the same failures that we've seen before, and that is exactly what Biden is proposing. Today, we know that the Iran deal that I'm speaking of is even worse than people like me, like people like Mike Duran had argued about back in 2015. We know it's worse. We've seen the evidence that it's actually worse. And you guys can all look at that evidence as well. And for Biden to say, no, that's the deal, we want to get back into it, with the sunset provisions expiring already, is insanity. It makes Western liberals feel good, and in reality, it's an utter failure. It's just not the way forward.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Brodsky. We'll have a very quick rebuttal from Professor Strawson, 2 minutes.
Well, I think that the question of Palestinian self-determination was very well put by Amos Oz. It's not for the Americans to tell the Palestinians how to exercise self-determination. It's not for the Israelis. As Amos Oz, the late Amos Oz writer, said, the reason that the Palestinians had the right of self-determination is because they're there, because they exist. And I'm sure the United States doesn't want to be told by anyone else how it should exercise its self-determination. And I think it should extend that right to the Palestinians. I'm afraid to say the idea that you can have a negotiations, you can tell people in the 21st century, like a colonial master of the 19th century, how to run their country. I think those days are over, and they should well be over. And I have to say, international institutions, which I have to say the United States was the architect of many of the international institutions which Trump has attacked, the United Nations, of course, in particular, but also I have to say the whole development of international criminal justice was a particular policy of the United States administration, the Roosevelt administration and Truman, and the ICC is very much a consequence, it seems to me, of what American policy was. Just to say this, look, what Matthew is talking about essentially, the policy which the Trump administration follows is a policy of division. It has no other idea in terms of strategy but to divide. So I am accused of being, I'm a Western liberal, okay? So therefore anything I say must be therefore as a consequence of Western liberal. I wouldn't myself call myself a Western liberal, but anyway, that's neither here nor there. But that illustrates the way in which what you try to do is you say there's people on one side who have crazy views. We're told these are crazy views. They're not issues which you can debate because they're crazy. And that's precisely the kind of way in which we've had policy by tweet from the United States since day one of the Trump administration. We've not had a coherent policy. It's all very well for Matthew to go on and say about the joint agreement with Iran. All this was a terrible, terrible disaster, but he, of course, has proposed nothing as an alternative whatsoever. He has no plans, and the Trump administration has no plans or ability to prevent the development of a nuclear weapons program by the Iranian regime. Why is that? Because they walked away from the only mechanism which was, in fact, slowing that development.
Great. Thank you, Professor Strawson. And a very quick rebuttal from Mr. Brodsky.
Sure. I think it's interesting that we drill down on the whole President Trump, his strategy is to divide and conquer in the Middle East. President Trump believes in sovereign state interests and in sovereign national interests. That's why he's pursued them with states who wanted to move forward where there are joint areas that they have agreement and view the threat matrix similarly. Another thing that's quite important, the policy of divide and conquer, if you actually look at that in terms of the peace process, it was the first Bush administration that came in and had the idea of comprehensive peace, right? He held the Madrid conference in '91. And that was to have Israel and then everyone else in the Arab world at the table at the same time, trying to make a comprehensive peace, which means, of course, that the lowest common denominator there, the worst of the states at the time, Syria, arguably still today, would be able to undermine whatever it is that any other state interest had and was negotiating. It was actually the Clinton administration that came up with the idea of divide and conquer, which was to have Israel have peace negotiations separately with separate states, and that the Palestinian-Israeli track was a separate track. And I happen to have been there and am quite appreciative of the fact that Jared Kushner's team met with all of the peace process practitioners in the United States from all the decades past, multiple times, listened to all of what they had to say, took it into account, and learned from those mistakes. This wasn't someone coming in like Godzilla and just, I'll kick everything over. It was a very well thought out idea that we listen to all the ideas that were there, see what has worked, and find a new way forward. Because all that the professor is saying is to try the same garbage again that does not work.
Thank you, Mr. Brodsky, and thank you both. Thank you for both of our speakers for a very exciting start to today's debate. Before we open the floor to questions from our students all around the UK, and in fact around the world, I'm going to take the moderator's privilege to ask a few pressing questions based on both opening speeches and rebuttals made by our speakers. Firstly, I have a question for Professor Strawson. You argued that the Trump administration has not pursued a grand strategic framework or approach towards the Middle East. You've argued that the Trump administration has pursued a quote-unquote policy of division, as well as a quote-unquote policy by tweet towards the Middle East. Now, some would argue in defense of the Trump administration that the administration has represented the sovereign will of the American people by withdrawing from prolonged conflicts in places like Afghanistan, attempting to withdraw slowly from places like Iraq, while doubling down support for existing allies like Israel and Saudi Arabia. Now, how would you respond to that critique, that there is in fact a certain golden thread tying all of the Trump administration's policy decisions, and that is one which brings back the United States from various engagements abroad that may not have been in the long-term national interest and certainly have caused much loss of blood and treasure for the United States.
It's been a very inconsistent policy. I mean, in Syria, the United States has let down its allies amongst the Kurds, who took the brunt of the fighting on the ground against ISIS, while the United States and others were in the air, and has allowed Turkey to intervene in the north, where you now have a policy of ethnic cleansing, of the cleansing of the Turks, of the Kurds, sorry, by the Turkish authorities. And in fact, indeed, not only the ethnic cleansing, but the imposing of a Turkish curriculum on the education in the region in the north, which I know quite well. So I think it's a very curious withdrawal that you've actually let down your allies in that regard. And it's not a withdrawal in a way, because they've allowed, and the Trump administration has been very supportive of the Saudi war in Yemen. And so by proxy, in a sense, the United States has been trying to achieve some of its aims by violence, although without, of course, American servicemen being risked, certainly in Yemen. Now, post-conflict Syria, what is the United States' position on that? We don't know. There is nothing at all. Post-conflict Syria is going to be very important because the Iranians, of course, want something out of that. The Russians, of course, want to maintain and strengthen their position. The Turks want something out of it. But what is the American policy on the question of Syria? We have no coherent policy on the question of Syria at all. It's all very well to say you're withdrawing from conflicts, but one of the ways of withdrawing from conflicts, there's two ways, isn't there? There's one that you end the conflict and you improve the situation. The other is that you leave, like the Americans left Vietnam, in great deal of leaving from the embassy by helicopter. And essentially that's what the Trump administration is doing in Afghanistan. I mean, it's basically handing the country over to the Taliban. This is an appalling consequence. And it really does mean that all those American soldiers, and indeed coalition soldiers who died trying to defeat terrorism in Afghanistan, have died in vain, because the Trump administration is going to hand over essentially to the Taliban. So I think this withdrawal from the Middle East, this apparent withdrawal from the Middle East and from the region, is very curious, and it has let down United States traditional allies. As far as the situation in Saudi Arabia and Egypt was concerned, all that the United States has done, it seems to me, is to support some extremely repressive policies by BNS and also by President Sisi, that basically what we actually have is an American policy of turning a blind eye to the murder and imprisonment of those who oppose the regime. And we're talking about very traditional liberal opposition to these regimes. Many people languishing in prison, and the United States is quite happy to turn a blind eye to it. So I don't believe that this is a healthy withdrawal from the region. I think it's a very unhealthy. It's leaving Syria in a mess. It's leaving Democrats in Egypt and those in Saudi Arabia in jail. And I don't think that's a very good result of the Trump administration's policies.
Thank you, Professor Strawson. Now I'm going to ask a variation of the same question to Mr. Brodsky. You've argued, of course, that Trump has doubled down on support for allies in the region, most notably Israel. Some would argue, as Professor Strawson just did, that Trump administration has thrown many of its existing allies under the bus. It's handing Afghanistan to the Taliban, arguably is in the process of handing Iraq to Iran. It may or may not be handing Syria to Assad, the Assad regime, and to Russian influence. and overall the effects of strategic withdrawal, the sort of haphazard strategic withdrawal, will and have not been terribly positive. How would you respond to that?
Right. Okay. Well, first of all, in Afghanistan, here's the issue. And let me be clear also from the outset, when it comes to issues such as Syria, the administration knows, even though I work with people at the National Security Council and with the State Department, I am not a huge fan of the Trump administration's policy in Syria. I do love, however, what the State Department has been able to do for Trump. And I will get to that in just a second. In Afghanistan, the problem that the president has had is that no one has outlined for him or has been able to clearly articulate what it is that a victory actually looks like, even pacification. And it's really hard, unfortunately, for an American president to essentially say this, and this, by the way, would be the policy if the United States stays there, which you can, by the way, argue is the right thing to do if you'd like to. It's just that he doesn't think so, is that we're there basically to keep our thumb in the dam and to prevent it from turning into the same, well, Trump called them S-hole countries previously, that would become a den of terrorism and create a brand new 9/11. So I'm sorry, we tried making Afghanistan into a flourishing place. We tried helping them with a constitution, with the government, and whatever. It is just not taking the soil, the plant won't grow. So we're just sitting there basically trying to make sure that, you know, the worst case scenario doesn't happen. And I'm sorry if your son and daughter dies there. He doesn't want to make that case. Look, I'm in Afghanistan. I don't see what the actual answer there is. But if you wanted to say what I just said and have that be your argument, plant your flag there, I get it. Now, when it comes to Syria, the issue is that President Trump has wanted to withdraw, of course, US from Middle East and from protracted conflicts. But here, I think the unfortunate thing is he could take reality if he wanted and actually use what his policy with what the State Department actually accomplished for him and use it to make a fantastic argument, which would be as follows. I am the smartest president that ever lived, and here's why. In Syria, I used 1,000 to 2,000 US troops in just a background role, relied on our proud Kurdish allies who actually prosecuted the war for us. Not more than a handful of US troops, unfortunately. Anyone that dies is horrible, but hardly anyone has been killed on the American side. And with that, what we achieved was we hold 1/3 of the Syrian territory, over 90% of the hydrocarbon sector. And with that, we are able to tell and dictate where reconstruction money is going to go, because we know it will be abused by Assad and Russia and Iran. And we don't want that to happen. We would like to help in the northeastern province area and to turn some of that area into a place that can flourish and use that as leverage. That, I think, would have been a very good argument for him to have made. But since we're talking about Syria and we're talking about Iran, as the professor did, we have to back up and again understand how it is we got to this place, okay? Because in 2011 is when, after Obama put Joe Biden, in charge of America's withdrawal from Iraq, that was done by 2011, it was after that period where you had Al-Qaeda in Iraq morph into what became ISIS. You don't have that vast territory from which ISIS grew with all the brilliant ideas of Joe Biden, who we're supposed to support somehow. Now, let's look at the actual civil war in Syria. Began in March 2011 as a protest. This was something by 2013 the US had proof that there were chemical weapons being used. The red line, of course, we know Obama didn't decide to enforce then. And he invited Russia in, as though Russia had our interest. For all these Democrats that keep arguing that Trump and Russia, this nonsense, it was Obama who put Russia in larger numbers by September 2015 inside of Syria. Now, at this point, you already have ISIS growing. The administration, the Obama administration, checked in December 2015 during a press conference Obama gave. He actually used, which is diplomatic terminology we should use, that Iran has certain regional equities that we respect. In this question, the answer he was giving was to say he was selling, at that point, Syria and its people to Iran so that he could get this garbage JCPOA deal. So he slow walked even the war against ISIS to begin with. It wasn't until Trump came into office. You can argue that it was the same plan from the DOD, the Defense Department, and we simply, Trump just simply added fuel to that and made it go Mach 5 or something. But that's literally what happened. You had in Syria a disaster of a policy by Obama beforehand. The unfortunate reality is that Obama came in to office and looked at Iraq and said, that's not my problem. That's G.W. Bush's problem. I want nothing to do with it. And then you could argue that Trump came into office, looked at Syria and said, that's not my problem. That's Obama's problem. I want nothing to do with it. But in the meantime, the topic at the highest level here is Biden's administration going to be better for the Middle East? And the fact is, we have a demonstrated pattern where even their own Secretary of State during their time, Robert Gates, has said, you haven't seen someone be so wrong so frequently on American foreign policy as Joe Biden. His instincts are horrible. So to the extent that there have been a very comprehensive strategy from the Obama administration, and I agree there was, it was a horrible, horrible policy that worked against American interest and that of our allies. And the thing is, he put it together brilliantly and executed it that way. I wish the Trump administration could as brilliantly execute its policy to the same extent that the Obama administration did, but they had the backing of the media at the time as well and other sort of advantages.
Thank you, Mr. Brodsky. Now we're going to open up the floor to a number of questions from our students, following from all around the world. The first question comes from Arbor Gega from University College London. And Arbor is asking, how competent are either vice president in dealing with Middle East? Of course, Kamala Harris can likely become president, according to Arbor, if Biden's abilities deteriorate. This is the question for both of our speakers.
Who would you like first?
Professor Strawson, please.
Well, I think that Albert's question obviously is perfectly reasonable, that both Biden and Harris, which I think is an excellent team, as a matter of fact, and Kamala Harris has been publicizing the Biden-Harris administration's potential administration's policy on the Middle East only yesterday, and made it very clear that it was about returning to a two-state solution. It was about, in terms of Palestine and Israel, it was about dealing with going back to the Iranian nuclear deal. It was about opposing annexations by Israel of Palestinian territory. It was about restoring America's policy on defending human rights in the region. And it seems to me that that is perfectly reasonable. Now, I know full well that the main problem for the incoming American administration on all foreign policy is going to be restoring the Department of State. The Department of State has been systematically denuded of officials during the Trump administration. Even the American ambassadors around the world, there's lots of posts that have not been properly filled, where there's temporary ambassadors and so on and so forth. So I think that one of the big things, that the big challenges for a Biden-Harris administration will in fact be to restore the State Department to its position. The American State Department has a brilliant tradition of great diplomacy and has a large reservoir of experts. And what Trump has done is replaced those experts with basically his cronies, which I have to say, it seems to be a feature of populism, that you dispense with experts and you have your friends help, and in this case, relatives, working for you instead. And this is not really the professional way to run a foreign policy, and it's not the way to deal with the Middle East. So what I hope we will see under a Biden-Harris administration is the return of the State Department as a serious player in the development of American foreign policy.
Wow. Yeah, see, I work with the people in the State Department, and I know the people there. So the idea that they've been gutted of the institutional knowledge that they've had is, I mean, nonsense completely. I mean, yes, we no longer have, though, John Kerry work there, of course. The guy who tried to undermine the Trump administration foreign policy by immediately trying to meet with the boss and Javad Zarif from Iran and saying, just wait out the administration. So we didn't have the people who tried to undermine the United States. And correct, we didn't have the people who are as brilliant as Wendy Sherman, the woman who failed at putting together the North Korean nuclear deal in the 90s, who then, because of that wonderful success, was then thrust into being part of the nuclear team with Iran, because boy, that's a wonderful success record. We didn't have her there too. She's the one who, by the way, after the Obama administration lied for months about what was in the JCPOA, just called it, it was a rhetorical flourish. Oh, okay. What was in the deal verifying previous military dimensions of what was Iran working on in the nuclear program? Just a rhetorical flourish. It wasn't actually a thing that the United States needed to know that we were promised. So yeah, some of those folks aren't there. There are new folks who are smart. And again, what the professor is laying out is just a regurgitation of the same garbage that has not worked. At some point, when you see things that don't work, you try something different. And the idea of having an agreement, because an agreement is an agreement, and therefore it must be a good thing. Like, that's insane. It's the same thing as you heard from the Obama administration. Well, we told you that we were going to tell you that we could verify all the previous dimensions, and we would have the best inspections capability of Iran's nuclear program, which they didn't. They then said, they then told us that, you know, they didn't need to know any of that stuff, and that it was something that was simply unimportant, that we had absolute knowledge, as John Kerry said. These are things that they gave away the farm to begin with. These are not the kind of deals that the United States should be interested in making. And I'm sorry, if Europe feels that that deal was so good, and even at this moment, individual European nations would much rather have economic deals with Iran, which is repressing their people to an unparalleled degree. But let's just talk about Yemen, right? Which the professor called the Saudi war, not an Iranian war, incidentally. That's weird. We have Europe, unfortunately, the states there would like to have deals with Iran. For them, economic deals are more important, apparently, than preventing them from having more weaponry like they apparently can get now, from them being able to ship this around to countries that are failed, such as Venezuela. This is what they do. So look, we have a very different type of strategy from the Trump administration, and you just have a repetition of the same garbage that may sound good in faculty lounges and at coffee shops, but in reality do not work. This administration wants solutions that actually work, and work most for the American people.
Thank you, Mr. Brodsky. We have another question for both of our speakers, beginning with Professor Strawson. This is Dalia Levy from IDC Herzliya in Israel. Dalia is asking, what will the Biden administration do differently in his attempt for a two-state solution that previous leaders have tried and failed to do? What will be so different about the Biden two-state peace process? Thank you.
Well, Dalia asked a very important question, which of course I can't tell you the exact answer to that question because the administration is not in place. What I do think is that you cannot begin to create a Palestinian-Israeli resolution until you have both sides signed up to an agreement. And that for both sides to sign to agreement, there's two requirements, actually. The first is that both sides regard the other as being a legitimate part of the conflict. And secondly, that both sides believe the time has come to resolve it. Now, you can only do that, and we have seen this in the Middle East so many times before. It's very interesting. Matthew wants to throw out all the experience of Middle East diplomacy. How did we learn from it? How did we get to the Camp David agreement between Israel and Egypt? It wasn't a consequence of a military defeat of the Egyptians. It was a consequence that the Egyptians thought in 1973 that although they didn't win the war in the sense that that their strategic aims weren't achieved, but they felt they'd done so well in that war, they felt strong enough to make an agreement with Israel. And that's Mohammed Haikal, the editor of Al-Ahram at the time, the semi-official newspaper, made this point very well before the Camp David agreement. He said, because we think we won, it was a psychologically important thing. And if you go to Cairo, you can see the October War panorama in the north of Cairo, which celebrates the 1973 war. That's precisely how Egypt saw it. And that's a very important lesson. The lesson of that is that you make agreements with those who feel that they are a legitimate part of the conflict, and they have the strength to make the agreement. Because each side will have to make compromises, and you can't make compromises from a position of weakness. You have to make them from positions of strength. So what I hope the Biden administration will do, what it looks like it will do, is first of all restore the economic aid to the Palestinian Authority, which will help the administration of the Palestinian administration, to the Palestinian refugees, which will restore issues such as running of the schools, the running of hospitals, and so on and so forth. That's what the humanitarian aid goes to. It's about, the combined amount is about $600 million a year, which is a very small amount for American budget, but a huge amount for such a small area, which is Palestine. And that, I think, will begin to create confidence building. And we have to rebuild the confidence between Israelis and Palestinians. And the second thing I think we have to say, that a Biden administration will have to say to Benjamin Netanyahu and to any Israeli prime minister, you cannot just do what you want. You cannot go around breaking international law. You cannot propose annexation of Palestinian territory. You have to abide by the international rules-based system that we have, that Israel and Palestine have both have an absolute right to self-determination, to secure statehood, and that is what they need to do. So I think it's a question of returning to a principle, but of course, and I quite agree with Matthew, you don't just apply one principle always in the same way, but you have to obviously develop other means to do it. And I think that I think is, but if you don't have the principles, you actually can't begin to get the resolution of the conflict. So that's my initial answer to Dalia.
I need to take a crack at that one, if I might. Okay, so that question came from someone at the IDC in Herzliya, right? So this is essentially what he just told you in reality. You, Israel, are too strong and too secure right now. And what you need to have happen is suffer more so that the Palestinians can have more, I don't know, perhaps terrorism success, and then they can build more squares and name more streets after martyrs, right? Suicide bombers. So we can create this fiction that the Palestinian leaders are in fact on equal footing with Israel because the power of the weak is too desperate to actually come together and make a deal. That's what you were just told. That's insane, okay? The idea, I'm quite fine with our relations with Egypt right now, but the idea, sure, Egypt attacked Israel in the Yom Kippur 1973 war, and right, they celebrate their grand victory with monuments, and it made them feel well enough. The fact is, in this situation between Israelis and Palestinians, the Palestinians haven't accepted that they lost because the international community keeps telling them you haven't. The way actual agreements are made in history from the beginning of time is that one side wins a war and then kind of imposes their peace agreement on it. Now, there are situations where that happens and it leads to dreadful things, such as the end of World War I, which brought about World War II. But there are ways where you don't have to actually sacrifice your allies for what amounts to a bad faculty lounge science experiment where we've already had examples of its repeated failure over and over again. So no, I disagree. I don't think we need to try the same crap again, and we don't need to weaken Israel so we can strengthen the fiction and mythology that prevents Palestinian leadership from dealing with reality and coming to the table to make a deal that's actually possible and good for their people. Because the fact is that no one wants to deal with, apparently, is that the leadership of the Palestinian Authority is the happiest with the way things are. They can handle this forever. What the professor is arguing is that this should just stay as it is until this day comes, and that can then lead to an agreement. So that the United States shouldn't have its own sovereign interests, the rest of the Middle East shouldn't have sovereign interests. If Biden wins, should we wait and see if we hear about Biden talking to Saudi Arabia and to MBS to say, we don't want normalization. No, we don't want what you think is in your interest and what Israel sees in their interest. We want to step in and get involved in zoning disputes inside of Israel so we can strengthen the Palestinian Authority so they can come to the table and once again argue for things that they will never, ever get in negotiations. That's just not something that's workable in reality. We should deal with the reality, not pipe dreams and the rehashing of old ideas.
Thank you, Mr. Brodsky. We have a final question from Dan Mikalyov, studying at the London School of Economics. And Dan is asking, how do you think a Biden presidency will impact the regional role of Turkey? Turkey's actions in Syria, of course, as well as Turkey's broader participation in the region and its general adherence to the principles of NATO. That question for both Professor Strawson and Mr. Brodsky.
Am I supposed to answer? Okay, first. Okay, well, I think a very good question, Dan, and I think the question of Turkey in its position in the Middle East is now extremely important, and you're quite right. The intervention in Syria has totally transformed, I think, the prospects for a post-conflict Syrian solution. And I don't think Turkey is going to easily leave, having arrived. And as I said, it arrived with it's not only its guns, but also its school books. That's very worrying. I think a Biden administration is going to have to take this on. The problem, I think, with President Trump is, as we know, a lot has been said by Matthew about, supporting his allies. Actually, he doesn't support his allies. He doesn't support his allies in NATO, in the British or the French, or indeed the Germans. He doesn't really support democratic allies. He's rather fascinated by authoritarians. And President Erdogan is such an authoritarian. I have to remind you what President Erdogan said about democracy. He said, democracy is like a bus. When you arrive at your destination, you get off. I hope President Trump doesn't have the same view when he sees the election results, as a matter of fact. But anyway, I'll leave that. But I think you're quite right. The question of Turkey, of having a proper relationship with Turkey, is extremely important. And part of that, I think, is having a view on the questions of human rights. Now, as we know, in Turkey, since the failed coup, there has been a massive repression of large sections of Turkish society, academics, lawyers, civil servants, people in religious institutions, students, who have essentially many lost their jobs, many are facing long terms of imprisonment for trumped up charges, as a matter of fact. And I hope that the Biden administration will look both at the question of having a policy on human rights in relationship to Turkey, but also will look at Turkey's role in the post-Syrian conflict. Basically, what we have now is a member of NATO with an extremely large military force, it should be said, acting in a way which is probably contrary to NATO, but has been given the green light by the United States. And I think that this underlines the real importance of having a multilateral approach to foreign policy and to the Middle East, and that we need to work together to try to create and to recreate a better situation in Syria. And we don't want to leave Syria just broken up, it seems to me, into different spheres of influence, with Assad, with the Russians and the Iranians, with the Turks in the north. And Matthew talked about formerly that Syria had been handed over to the Russians. I would point out that the Russians have had a warm water port in Syria for many decades, and Russians are already there. They've never left.
And by 4 people, by the way, for about a decade previously, if you really want to look at the port. But your point is taken, sure.
Matthew, I'm sure you want to answer that question on Turkey.
Right. Look, honestly, with the professor, when it comes to Turkey, I don't disagree with him. I think Turkey's playing an incredibly pernicious role in the region. It would like to be the Neo-Ottoman power. It would like to be the big dog on the block. It plays a very horrible role when it comes to Israel. We've seen that from 2009 in their terrorist-sponsored flotilla. Turkey is not an American friend, and of course they are in NATO, and the long and short of this, because the question is always then, why can't we kick them out? There actually is no way in NATO to kick out a member. You can basically minimize their role as much as you possibly can, but they're in NATO. And frankly, the Defense Department, I would just point to this for those of you nervous about the Trump administration likes Erdogan. In the US, it takes institutions a long time to change their viewpoints. And usually when it came to Turkey or any NATO ally, it was the Defense Department, the Pentagon, that was always the last people. They were the ones always saying, we need Turkey, they're a major ally for us, their location. What we've seen in the past few years, though, from Erdogan is enough to actually have it changed the thinking inside the Pentagon. The whole F-35 deal that Erdogan's like, oh, just give us the F-35 and we'll have the Russian-made S-400 advanced air defense system playing next to each other. Like, clearly the Defense Department hates that. I will say, though, when it comes to authoritarianism, though, just on that part where Trump tends to like dealing with that, let's remember that bringing it back to the Iran deal, in the United States, when you have a deal that is made with a foreign country that involves so many other foreign countries on something as consequential as the nuclear weapon disposition of a terrorist state in the Middle East, Iran, the US has a process for that everyone has followed since the beginning of the United States being a country, and that is to have a treaty. And in the United States, there's a way you go about that, and it requires a higher number of votes in Congress. But Obama decided he's the authoritarian. He said, I don't need to have a treaty. What I can do is do a bunch of little executive orders from the presidency, and then I can create this web with the UN, all of which will seal up and create this deal. The thing he put before Congress for them to argue about, it was not something that could prevent him from doing precisely what he did. It was to essentially throw a little bone to the Senate to have a discussion, but it couldn't prevent him from doing the deal because he decided, and frankly, Republicans didn't challenge him hard enough to say that you can't do this. We have a way of doing it. But Obama decided he was an authoritarian. He also decided he was an authoritarian. He'll deal with Iran. His deal to get that with Iran, the nuclear deal, was important enough that he could sell out all of Syria and let it go to Iran. He wasn't going to cross that red line. And he decided that Putin is important enough to have for this horrible deal with Iran that, okay, he'll invite them into Syria to enlarge their port. Yes, their one port, the only external port outside of Russia, naval port, that Russia has had, which was manned by about 4 people, according to Syria's own newspapers up until the revolution starts in later 2011, which is when Russia starts building that out and building a new air base near there, okay? This was Obama deciding, I like dealing with Putin. I need him at the table, so I'll give him that. So the idea that it's okay to make deals with leaders that are strong makes sense in certain circumstances in that. I mean, you can argue that Trump's positions haven't been consistent 100% across the board. In fact, I make that argument myself from time to time and have again here today. But the thing you can't say, though, is that his policies are worse for the United States or the region. We're in the United States listening to Europeans frequently argue. They do this with me when I'm on TV shows arguing on the news all the time about how Biden administration is going to reestablish our credibility with our allies. Okay, what that means is to reestablish with our Western European elite allies. When it comes to the Middle East, we are in with our allies, with Israel, with Saudi Arabia, with Egypt, with the UAE, with Bahrain, with a whole host of countries there. And we have European friends as well. The fact is, if Europe doesn't want to join the United States and prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, and instead you guys want to pretend that the nuclear deal actually prevents Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, which is the point of the deal to begin with, then that's a fiction you guys are selling yourselves. And the United States is not going to go along with it under a Trump administration. So we have strengthened our allies under this president. We just have a different view of them. We don't want to be strategically realigned like we were with Obama, with Iran on one hand and the Muslim Brotherhood on the other hand. We're just not doing it this time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brodsky. Now we're going to open up the floor to both of our speakers for their final remarks. We've had a very, very heated discussion covering a broad range of subjects. We've talked about Turkey's role in the region. We've talked about Syria, Russian intervention in Syria. We've talked about the negotiations with the Taliban in Afghanistan, Iraq, withdrawal from Iraq, greater presence in Iraq for Iran, the Iranian nuclear deal, and of course the Trump peace plan for Israel-Palestine. Hopefully we can tie everything up for our final remarks. I will give the floor now to Professor Strawson, 2 minutes, followed by Mr. Brodsky, 2 minutes for final conclusion.
Thank you very much, Joseph. I mean, this discussion, and I regret some of the use of terms like garbage and so on and so forth. I think we need to exchange views in these kinds of debates. And I think that very much represents the kind of tenor of debate Mr. Trump administration has introduced into domestic politics of the United States, but also into its international relations. And I think that is should be regretted. The fact of the matter is that Matthew has made a big point. He keeps saying that the Iran deal was horrible. He doesn't tell you why it's horrible. He doesn't explain what the alternative to it is, what the Trump administration is. He doesn't tell you that actually, since the Americans walked away from it, the Iranians have returned to the development of their nuclear program in a very, very aggressive way and are now much nearer it. He doesn't tell you that actually American policy in Iraq, in Syria, has extended Iranian political influence dramatically. Basically, Iraq is in the transformation of becoming into the sphere of the Iranian government. A post-conflict Syria, the only reason that Iran is not going to be completely dominant is because it finds itself fighting two other forces, the Turks in the north, but also the Russians, who have who've had a long-term interest, first of all as the Soviet Union, and now as the Russian Federation, in Syria as being a very important geographical and strategic point for them in the Middle East. So I think the truth of the matter is, after this 4 years of the administration, what we've actually had is, in terms of Iran, is an extension of Iranian influence and the development, we're much nearer the nuclear weapons systems, which the Iranians are now actively working on. That doesn't seem to be a very good result. We are clearly nowhere near any agreement with the Palestinians. In fact, I think even the Trump administration themselves seem to not talk about the deal of the century anymore. They've given up on that entirely. And so I think that plan, despite all its details, and I've read every word of it, is essentially dead in the water from the beginning. So it wasn't really a deal, and it wasn't really the deal of the century. It was a charade, and it was part of this terrible process of stirring up division. And I think Matthew's comments on relations with the United States, relations with Europe, are very, very telling, because what actually he is saying is, oh, the Europeans are merely elite allies, but we have real allies in Saudi Arabia. Now, I have to say, I'm all in favor of the reforms that Saudi Arabia has undertaken when they have undertaken them. But I have to say, I know Saudi Arabia little quite well, and the truth of the matter is that at the present time, we actually, under MBS, we have a man who is quite prepared to murder his opponents abroad, quite happy to lock up large numbers of people who are merely asking for the most basic rights in the country, is carrying out a internal war against the Shia minority in the Northeast. And this is an ally which the Trump administration says is a great ally. Now, this seems to be extraordinary. So on the one hand, Matthew is telling you, the trouble with a Biden administration, they're going to suck up to the Iranians. However, it's perfectly easy for the Trump administration, however, to make this very strategic alliance with the Saudis. Not just an alliance, strategic alliance, but actually giving a huge amount of political support and indeed cover for some of the human rights violations that have been committed. The truth of the matter is a Biden administration will hopefully draw a line in the sand after this administration, will strengthen the State Department. Now, I wasn't talking about John Kerry and the political appointments. I'm talking about the officials who have very much been denuded in the State Department. I know very well, because I know precisely some of them who they are. I know there's been a sidelining of ex-professional experts, and that has been, I think, a great disaster. As a consequence, we've not had a comprehensive policy by the United States towards the Middle East. What we've actually had is an episodic policies, 1 minute this policy on Syria, the next minute this on Afghanistan, the next on Palestine, Israel. Move the embassy. What was the point of moving the embassy? The ambassador is hardly ever in Jerusalem. It's absolutely, in the embassy, in the so-called embassy, it's absolutely extraordinary. What we actually need is a comprehensive strategy in relation to the Middle East. And the Americans have played, obviously, a controversial role in the Middle East. But when they're not playing a role in the Middle East, things on the whole are not as good as they could be. And I think that for the future of Israel and for the future of our friends in the Middle East, we actually do need to restore the rules-based system. We need to have professional American diplomats, and we need to think of recreating the conditions in which we can have genuine Palestinian-Israeli negotiations. The way in which Matthew chose to talk so ideologically about the Palestinians indicates to me he actually doesn't really know Palestine that well, because Palestinians on the whole do not act in the kind of rather extremist characterization which he put. The truth of the matter is that most Palestinians, all opinion surveys show this, most of the Palestinian public want a two-state solution, and they want to live in peace alongside Israel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Strawson. Now, final closing remarks from Mr. Brodsky.
Well, as CNN would probably classify this type of discussion we had, would be fiery but peaceful. So look, if I use the word garbage to describe some ideas, it's frankly, if we're having a free exchange of new ideas, I'm completely open to and listening to them, and I'm listening to exactly what I'm hearing today. But what I find to actually just not be particularly helpful. And yes, unfortunately, I just see as nonsense, frankly, to repeat these same things, to try to repackage the same stuff that has not worked for decades, and to say, well, what we're going to do this time is this. We're going to try this. And everyone is looking at that saying, wait, well, we've done that. We've done that over and over again. It doesn't work. That's kind of a problem. Now, since the centerpiece of a Biden administration is going to be in the Middle East, is going to be about the nuclear deal, perhaps I wasn't clear on what the problem with the nuclear deal was. Okay, we enriched the regime with over $100 billion for them to spend throughout terrorism as an incentive to make the deal. The deal, we were supposed to and were promised we would be able to verify the previous military dimensions of what Iran was working at. But Iran said, we aren't actually trying to make a nuclear weapon. So John Kerry and his team said, oh, okay, I guess we don't need to know about a previous military dimension. The reason you need to know what that is because you need to have a measuring stick and metrics to measure whether Iran is cheating or not, which gets to the other point. We were supposed to have a really intrusive inspections regime so that we would be able to know if Iran is cheating. But of course, that didn't happen. Frankly, Iran could simply turn a sign that says nuclear on this establishment behind me and turn it around like it's a cartoon to have it say military on the other side. And then no one has access to it. No one can look at it. So we didn't know what they had before. We were promised that. And we weren't allowed to actually figure out the ways in which they were cheating. And the IAEA has been hamstrung as a result of it. So the deal itself, even if those aspects were taken care of, which they weren't, had sunset provisions. Like I said, already a few weeks ago, conventional arms ban comes off. The United States was actually, with the European countries, we're supposed to help Iran develop its new centrifuges. Unbelievable, it's IR-8s they're called. We're supposed to help them have better technology in their nuclear program. The deal, again, would leave off, after the sunset clauses, would leave them a screw's turn away from having a nuclear weapon. You can't have that. That's just the problem. Look, we just have a disagreement on the whole, what's the point of moving the US embassy to, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem? This, to the Trump administration, and frankly to me, and I'm sure to most Israelis, sounds like how controversial it is that we declared loudly that gravity exists or the world is round. The capital of Israel is in Jerusalem. Where did Anwar Sadat fly when he wanted to make peace that led to the Camp David Accords in the late 70s? He flew to Jerusalem to speak to the Knesset, which is in Jerusalem, to speak to the Israeli people there. He knew that that's where the capital was. The United States finally figured that part out. Okay, so I don't think that this part is really based on reality. The Trump administration has a demonstrated track record of success in the Middle East. You can argue that it may not be that it may be disjointed, but it's far better for the American people, and frankly, it's far better for Europe. And yes, I still stand by what I said. I don't like when the president, frankly, tries to downplay NATO's role. I agree with the thinking of American generals who've said if there wasn't a NATO, we would have to invent one. But the fact is, when it comes to things that are vital to our interest, and certain countries demonstrate that they would rather have economic deals with Total and Iran, for example, or other economic deals with Iran, then they're far more important to them than actually figuring out a way to make a nuclear agreement with Iran that is actually worth anything, then that's just not where the United States under a Trump administration can go. I think that's good, obviously, for our regional allies in the Middle East, because they agree with it. And I'm talking about, obviously, from the Gulf region all the way to parts of Africa. So I think we should not have a return to what has not worked before. That's who you are going to see employed back in the State Department. These are the people you'll see from the Obama administration put back in. You know exactly what you're going to get. The Trump administration, the biggest argument people have is his communication style. They don't like how he says in his tweet by policy, I'm not a huge fan of that either. But look, I deal with reality and have to deal with the policies as they are. And his policies are fantastic for the United States and the Middle East. And hopefully the Palestinian leadership can join us in that and do what's best for their people as soon as they decide that that's something that they need to do.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brodsky, and thank you very much to both of our speakers this evening. It's been an absolutely fascinating, high-pitched, high-paced, completely mesmerizing debate. We've covered a broad range of issues, many different countries in the region, and it's been heated but peaceful. I like that. Hopefully, our followers will be able to digest the many issues discussed, the many angles, and of course, if any of our followers are viewing from America, perhaps this debate may be able to sway their views one way or the other. We look forward to the results later this evening that will be coming from the United States, and of course, we all hope from the Pinsker Center that either way, regardless of who wins the presidency, the future administration will be to the benefit of the United States, its allies, the UK, Israel, and other allies in the Middle East. So once again, thank you very much to our speakers. And now I'll just hand the floor to the Pinsker Center for final remarks.
Thank you very, very much, Joseph. And thank you so much to our speakers. Just a final word. Please watch out for what we've got coming next. I mentioned at the beginning of this event, we have our next event with Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, which is coming up very, very soon. In relation to this event, thank you so much for coming here, expressing your views and doing so in their entirety and in their fullness, and having a very lively discussion and debate. Thank you very much, Professor Strawson, for joining us once again. Thank you very, very much, Mr. Brodsky. Really invaluable to both of you for having such a lively and exciting conversation. And of course, I must thank our moderator, Joseph Kosk, for taking out the time for being with us this evening. And on a final note, before I say good evening, I'd like to thank our partners for this event, which is the RRIS IDC Debate Society, University College of London International Relations Society, Manchester Young Conservatives, and the Israel Associations at Birmingham and Warwick University. Please stay tuned for future events, and please have a wonderful evening. Thank you very much for joining us. Good night.